I've discussed my favorite final bosses in fighting games and their top warriors as the sub-bosses, but what about the lower subordinates, the henchmen if you will? Sometimes these henchmen are the lowest ranking fighters in their organization, and other times they're just a step below the sub-boss. But regardless, to their boss, these henchmen are merely a dime a dozen. Maybe there's a bit more loyalty, but it depends on the story. They essentially go out there just to lose to the player 1 character all the time, but still as a worthy obstacle on the way to the top of the ladder. So let's take a look at the most iconic fighting game henchmen. Their power levels and relevance may vary, but they fill the role of henchmen well without being generic. Or maybe they are a tad generic, but that adds to their charm. There may even be some fighting game characters that originated in non-fighting game properties. Now, let's clean up the top 10 henchmen in fighting games. Number 10, John Crowley from The Art of Fighting. The first 2 Art of Fighting games are full of henchmen, or so it seems. The first game has a bunch of fights on your way to rescue the main character's sister, and the second game has all the opponents from the first game as playable characters, along with a few extras, but only a few of them were actually henchmen for the main villain behind everything. The rest of the opponents were just people who wanted to fight for the sake of fighting and did not care about the very dire situation going on. The 2 characters that did act most closely to henchmen were Jack Turner and John Crowley, both working for Mr. Big, the sub-boss and crime lord of the city. Their designs fit the role of generic henchmen well, since they look like they could be any random enemy in a beat-em-up game. Jack is a bit more memorable to me since he's one of the first guys you face and he has a Hulk smash style moveset, so I'll give this entry to John Crowley since he probably never gets any love, and I can see why. He's a random blonde American army guy with sunglasses, so he's already been overshadowed in terms of design and coolness by both Guile and Johnny Cage. John's just kind of a guy, which is good for the nameless henchman theme of this list, but bad if he ever wants to appear in an SNK game again with fan support. His moveset is actually pretty cool for the time. It's a standard projectile and punch moveset, but his punches can form the energy waves, so he flashes it up. Wait a second, that's just a sonic boom. He also has this aerial spin, which defies physics more than usual in this game. His reason for being a henchman is because Mr. Big saved his career after John was forced to retire from the Navy, so he's kinda just doing this because Mr. Big was nice to him once. He's then not a bad guy in the second game, where he's now fighting against the bad guys, but he's such an insignificant character in the grand scheme of things that his motivations were never fully defined. You know what? Let's put John in King of Fighters someday. We'll see what he's been up to.
It's that exciting.
Number 9, Raven from Guilty Gear. It's hard to find a low-level henchman in the Guilty Gear series since all the characters on the roster supersede that ranking. So if I had to go with the character that does the most henchman work despite being above that level, I'd say it's Raven, mostly due to his loyalty to the original main villain of the series, Asuka, aka That Man, aka Gear Maker. As that last name implies, he made the gears, the biological weapons of war in the series. Though of his names, I've always preferred That Man over the others since that's been his alias for most of the series. That Man has 3 major servants, Ino, Jacko, and Raven. Ino doesn't really consider herself a part of That Man's regime, and Jacko is a free spirit who doesn't have all of her memories back, so that makes Raven the only one of the group who seems to be happy with his place serving That Man. This sets him up for henchman work, even though Raven is well above the duties of a simple henchman. That Man has Raven fetch data, watch over the results of new projects involving gears, and just be the eyes and ears of the organization when That Man isn't around. Raven's obedience isn't out of fear or full interest in the main goal, it's more just because he's bored due to being immortal, so Raven's just happy that he has something to do other than walking around not dying. Raven's also content helping out because it gives him a chance to experience pain with the this opportunity. Since he's immortal, even the most painful blows can't kill him. He's so used to normal pain that when he feels a new type of pain, it's actually exciting for him, and going around fighting on behalf of that man gives him a chance to see how much these other fighters can hurt him. His immunity to standard pain also makes his moveset more versatile, as he can absorb more hits and dislocate his bones and joints to extend his limbs for extra attacks. You think he's horribly breaking his arms? Heh, that's just stretching for him. He can also just do things that aren't painful for himself, like using his claws or projectiles that slow down his opponent, or for something more graceful, he can glide like a bird. Those feathers aren't just for show, except when he teleports, then those feathers are just for show. Number 8, Sarabella from Skullgirls. In the context of her relevance in the series, Sarabella doesn't seem like the henchman type. She can easily fend for herself with her hat that can grow giant arms, and she's on all the promo art, so what about her puts her in the underling henchman category? Well, it's mostly that her role in about half the character story modes is to be an obstacle in the way because she's defending the Mafia, due to her naivete and her lust over Vitali, the son of the head of the Medici Mafia. They like her skills and she likes their man, so they have an alliance of sorts. Sarabella goes on missions for them to prevent whoever from getting the life gem, or whatever's plot relevant in the character story mode that's going on. And mostly what happens to Sarabella is getting her ass kicked, except in her own story of course. Though even in her own story, she gets stopped in the middle of it by misfortune to be told that she's fighting for the wrong cause, and then in a bunch of other story modes, she's just a character that you beat up with no lines. In Beowulf's story, she's just a footnote, and in Eliza's story, she acts as the escort for Eliza to keep an eye on her on behalf of the Mafia, and then gets killed by Eliza. While it is a big deal that it happened, the fact that she gets killed off like a random grunt when Eliza's story was only halfway done and not even acknowledged for the rest of Eliza's story shows how the more powerful characters view her. This is not a testament to Sarabella's strength, as she's only in this position due to her poor decisions. She's very strong on her own. Some of the characters even point out that she seems like a good person, but is not working with good people, so being limited to only being a henchman when she could thrive as a whatever she wants to be, shows her room to grow as a character. In her own story mode, we see how useful of a henchman she can be, as she rolls over everyone, or more punches over everyone. As you can see, her hat does a lot of work, with all its grabbing, slamming, spinning around, but Sarabella is talented too, being a circus performer. She can leap in tandem with her hat and has a few surprises in her shoes. Not to mention, she can just pummel you with her own fists if she wants to. Oh, and she can carve pure diamond out of solid rock. I'm surprised the Mafia doesn't exploit that talent from her. Once Sarabella steps down from her henchman role, the sky's the limit for her, or however high she can get on the trapeze, or the tightrope, whichever circus act it is that she does. I just know that she's good at walking on things.
Did you okay, Vitali?
Number 7, like half the roster of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Heritage for the Future. The original JoJo's fighting game is one of the most fun fighting games you could play. It helped spark interest in JoJo's outside of Japan in the 90s, and it has very animated sprite work that is strong with manga references. But looking back at it, since it's filled with only Part 3 characters and young Joseph, I never really noticed that like half this roster is Dio's henchmen, and that's great. Each of those henchmen characters' original purposes were just to be challenges for one of the heroes and show off what stands could do at the time, but they weren't really designed to be full-fledged fighters. But Capcom had that inch and took a mile from it to make complete movesets with just a few chapters to reference for each one of them. While characters like Whole Horse, Pet Shop, and Vanilla Ice all made sense for the roster since they were the most active and elite guards for Dio, Capcom did so much with the fighters that never really went into into a head-to-head fight. Like they gave Devo a complex puppet character moveset despite his human self dying right away in the story. Rubber Soul was a great Kakyoin clone in-game to play on how he imitated Kakyoin in the series. Like they were able to reuse assets flawlessly to create him. Anubis is a sword, so it was easy to give him a sword guy moveset, which is just a good fighting style for a fighting game, so they essentially put him in the game 3 times. Mariah was all about trickery, so they made her a zoning trap character as a result. Alessi had no skills that would qualify him as a fighter, so they made half his moveset using the minimal scenes where he tried killing with an axe, and then they made his reverse aging stand a temporary debuff. And Midler, who never even appeared on screen, got a character model made just for the game so she could use her stand in a fight. The attention to detail and care for these characters, who were merely footnotes in the hero's journey, helped make them more iconic to JoJo's lore than they already were. This set a precedent for how I would like to see every JoJo's character in a fighting game someday. Imagine if each part got a fighting game like this. Think of all the henchmen. Part 4 could give that paper guy a moveset. Part 5 could make Pesci like that fisherman from The Last Blade. And if they did this for Part 2, we would have probably seen characters as minor as Donovan and Wired Beck get a moveset. Hell, I could see them doing a Suzy Q possessed by AC/DC moveset with how crafty Capcom was at reusing assets to make new characters in this game. I just hope one day we could get a JoJo's fighting game as detailed as Heritage for the future, since they did justice for both the heroes and henchmen alike. Number 6. Jack from Tekken. Jack is a series of robots that perform a bunch of odd jobs in the Tekken franchise. Their most henchman-related roles involve working for various immoral organizations and being a bunch of big metal dudes to punch when we need an obstacle, or they'll punch you first. Each Jack is built the same way until they get an upgrade, where they're all built the same in a new way. However, the Jack that gets the most attention is usually the one autonomous Jack whose memory gets passed on to each new model, since that's convenient for the plot. He's a stand-up guy who just wants to protect a little girl, who ends up growing up to become a scientist who works on preserving him. Though the henchman-style Jacks act differently, definitely not as wholesome. They come out in droves to attack the Mishimas, or sometimes work for them, usually getting disposed of easily, but they at least act as impediments to make the Mishimas work slightly harder to achieve whatever power grab they're going for. In terms of specific Jacks doing henchman duty, you have the original model in Tekken 1, who was entered in the tournament to take down Heihachi and prove that he can be mass-produced as a super weapon. And yeah, he kinda was. And then we saw Jack Cross in Street Fighter Cross Tekken, who was a backup version of the good Jack at the time. He was just created so we could have a somewhat evil Jack without it being related to the main good Jack that he looks like. This Jack was booted up by the kind of evil / chaotic neutral Brian Fury. He also spoke in full sentences, and it was weird since Jacks are normally silent, but he fought the same way, so that's all that mattered. Finally, there's Prototype Jack, who is the test model of the original Jack unit that Heihachi stole from Jack's creators, so he could use it against them when they tried to kill him with their own Jack. So Prototype Jack was a counter henchman for the henchman Jack that was sent. Prototype Jack is a surprisingly interesting character. He has some form of autonomy where he is jealous of the main Jack, and he can actually communicate with the Mishimas. During his time with the Mishimas, he demanded upgrades from them, and Kazuya was so annoyed with him that he told Dr. Boskanovich, who was working with Kazuya under duress, to upgrade Prototype Jack. All he did was put a hat and sunglasses on him and told him it was an upgrade, but then this Jack wanted to test his new alleged upgrades, so Kazuya put him in the tournament that was going on at the time to shut him up. And then after Tekken 2, we don't see him again canonically. I know he was near identical to Jack and we don't need that for the roster, but I miss his antics. We did get him in the Tekken Tag tournament games for some non-canon fun, but otherwise he was probably deactivated off screen at some point. Prototype Jack fights like regular Jack, where he can punch and kick real hard with some slow startup as a trade-off for his strength that could finish the match in merely a few hits. He also has more spinning arm attacks in later games, compared to regular Jack who's more about his extendo arms. Not sure about the next time we'll get to see this obsolete robot, but as long as he retains his personality, he'd be welcome as my henchman.
You win.
Number 5. Voldo from Soul Calibur. Voldo is the guard of the Money Pit. Not only is that a classic movie from the 1980s, but it's a treasure room in the 1580s. It belongs to the arms dealer Verci, who puts all his trust in Voldo to keep his treasure safe. Thieves come by to steal from it, but all that gets stolen are their lives, since Voldo will kill them instantly. I'm not even sure if they have a chance to fight back, since Voldo is very confusing. He's a contortionist wrapped in bondage gear who fights with metal claws, so upon seeing him, I don't know whether to be afraid, disturbed, or have some emotion that cannot be comprehended by human thought. He also doesn't speak, he only hisses at you, so if you never enter the Money Pit, you don't have to worry about meeting Voldo, right? Nope, Voldo leaves the Money Pit from time to time to search for his master's most desired treasure, the evil sword Soul Edge. Because of this, Voldo always appears as an obstacle for the other fighters on their way to steal or destroy Soul Edge, so he ends up just being an extra win on their way to the finish line. Even after his master dies, he still protects his treasure and still seeks out Soul Edge for him, making Voldo feel like that extra minion you have to fight no matter the game. Voldo later teams up with the keeper of Soul Edge, Nightmare, in part to get close to Soul Edge, but also because the sword echoes the voice of his master in his head to trick Voldo into thinking he's working for Verci all along. Either way, it continues to make Voldo an eternal henchman to someone working against the heroes. However, he's one fight you'll never forget, since there's no fighter like him. As mentioned, he has contortionist skills, but he does nothing normal with them. He gets on the ground and does the worm, walks on all fours upside down, and does the pelvic thrust of doom. No one told him he needs to fight this way, but that's what he does. He only uses his senses of hearing and touch to track the opponent when fighting, so his unique movements facilitate that. Though I still feel like there's something otherworldly about him. Look at him walk at these amazing speeds, and he can spin his opponent like they're on a turntable. Also, he never has a normal outfit. You can't predict which areas of his body will be exposed with his clothing choices. I'm not sure what led to Voldo's decisions here, but it makes him one of the most memorable henchmen. Number 4, Junie and Julie from Street Fighter. For this list, I wanted to find the lowest level henchmen that were still elite enough to be playable in each game series, and with the amount of guys that Dictator Bison employs, there were a lot of Street Fighter choices that sort of fell out of the henchman range I was looking for. Balrog, Vega, Sagat, and Fang all fit the henchman role, but they also look over the lower level henchmen that are still playable, so they're a bit too elite for this list. Birdie has the status of typical grunt, but I generally like his good guy appearances more than his Shadaloo stint in the story, so I think I'll go with a different character. Then you have the real grunts of Shadaloo with no personality, but they're only NPC enemies from time to time, and we never get to play as them, not that we would ever want to. But I think the happy medium of Shadaloo henchmen between all of these characters would be the dolls. The dolls are Bison's brainwashed assassins. Cammy is their leader, but two random members of the 12 of them were put in Street Fighter Alpha 3, named Junie and Julie, who definitely have that perfect mid-range henchman feel. They are very robotic in how they act, and they're not the strongest or the weakest that Bison has to offer. They're from a large group of essentially clone characters, so they could have just been nameless henchmen if Capcom didn't care enough to elaborate on their story. They only exist to prevent anyone from getting to Bison. They lack any personality of their own that isn't just defending Shadaloo, and they team up against you because evil doesn't need a fair fight, though they're definitely strong enough to take you on by themselves, but why bother when you can fight as a legion? I've always liked Junie and Julie's aesthetic. I know they were just palette swaps of Cammy, the main doll who broke away from Shadaloo first, but there was something about their demeanor. They come out with all the dolls before a fight, and they're like, let us handle this. The unstoppable killing machine nature of them is perfect for fighting and doing any dirty work for Bison, since they have no attachment to anyone. It shows in their arcade mode fight, since they'll go against anyone who Bison tells them to, and once they get started, they don't stop. They're basically the sub-boss of any character who doesn't have a rival, but if a character has a more important rival fight, they'll just sit that arcade mode out. If you play as them in the arcade mode, their storyline is to ultimately break them free of their brainwashing, but even if Bison loses them, he's got about 10 more, so no big deal for him. We later saw the doll DeCapre playable as a more unique Cammy clone in Street Fighter 4, and the rest of the dolls were NPCs in Street Fighter 5, so as long as Bison's around, there's always gonna be a Cammy clone around. Really, this entire entry could go to the dolls, since we got to see them lose to most of the Street Fighter 5 roster in that story mode, in true henchman fashion, though we can always credit Junie and Julie for being the first to show us the terrors of Bison's brainwashed army. Number 3, Blade from Street Fighter the movie, the game. Forget about the Street Fighter you once knew. Now we're talking about live-action Street Fighter movie canon, where Guile is the main character, Blanca is Nash, and Cammy is Kylie Minogue. Street Fighter the movie also had its own game with movie canon, and between all the live-action versions of the characters you know and love, and Sawada, is this random Shadaloo cyborg grunt known as Blade. His real name is unknown, his personality is nothing, and his power is in his code name. He fights with blades. Now when I think of a generic henchman, this is what comes to mind. We have no idea what he really looks like, and he could be mistaken for any other soldier working for Bison, but because he is such a generic soldier among this cast of recognizable characters, it actually kind of makes him stand out more, cause you're like, who is this guy? He's not even in the movie, but he's based on the standard Bison soldiers from it, so it's like he was there. His backstory in the game is that he's one of 4 soldiers put into the Shadaloo cybernetic program, so now he's an elite cyborg henchman. Not as elite as the other characters with more of an identity, but elite enough where he is sent to fight Guile. He technically has a shocking reveal that he's actually Guile's brother as an undercover agent in his arcade mode ending, but if you never get to that, on the surface, you'll simply view him as an evil henchman. The fact that the developers felt the need to pad this already full roster with this guy was bizarre enough, but even modern day Street Fighter has acknowledged his existence by giving him a character card in Street Fighter 5, which every character ever referenced in Street Fighter got, but it shows that Capcom has embraced the memes that the live action movie created, or they were really dedicated to that whole every character ever motif of the character cards. Either way, Blade gives you the experience of being a random dude in Shadaloo with none of the baggage of an evil or tragic backstory. Number 2, Sentinel in the Marvel vs. Capcom series. He may be another giant robot, but he gets the henchman job done. Sentinel are the robots who hunt the mutants in the X-Men universe, and they report back to their leader Master Mold, who deploys all the Sentinel to walk the streets to find their targets. He was first playable in X-Men Children of the Atom, where he just got to go around and do his job of beating all the mutants. While his design feels unique to us, the player, he's actually just one of many, so this could only be Sentinel number 553 that we get to play as, while the other 552 are off fighting somewhere else. Being mindless battle robots, they only know how to destroy, as that's what they were built for. They can extend their arms, shoot out plasma, and send out tiny versions of themselves to be annoying, or just combine those attacks. They're also very clunky. They take a long time to go through all the motions of their attacks, so they're open to getting smacked in the middle of everything, but they do have rocket boosters to help with mobility. As they transitioned from being in an X-Men game to being in the Marvel vs. Capcom crossovers, their hunting roles stayed the same, but their programming got confused, as there were more characters on the roster now unrelated to their mission. It wasn't all mutants anymore. If Sentinel ends up fighting a human, he'll just beat them and get on with the mission. If he's fighting a mutant, he'll go all target acquired and get serious, but if it's neither of those, he'll occasionally occasionally just get very confused if he fights something unusual to him. Like he has no idea what to do with Akuma when he scans his data. I know Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is not very lore heavy, but I always love to see Sentinel's little interactions with everyone when he robotically freaks out a bit at something he's never scanned before. Plus, Tron adopts Sentinel as her new Servbot in her ending, which is cute. I also like that despite his ever-changing designs and upgrades in the comics, the Sentinel that we see is always the same Mach 5 model, since its design is iconic to the Capcom fighting games, and they were reusing assets in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Maybe that's why his data on some of the fighters is outdated by Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Regardless, even though he's just set up to get knocked down in the end, this robot henchman won't stop until his power's at 0.
Player 1 wins!
Mutant entity eliminated. Operation successful.
For number 1, I'm going to the series that has the most henchmen per capita, Mortal Kombat. Shao Kahn recruits the fiercest warriors to do his bidding, so he gives us some prime candidates, like the Shokan, but they're usually his most elite fighters that he saves for the round before fighting him. Same for the Centaur. Maybe Noob Saibot? But he ventures off on his own a lot and seems like he can just dip whenever he wants to. Kano? Nah, he's more of a mercenary that's hired and can act alone. Plus, he has his own underlings. So I think it's really between two eternal minions for this spot. And I'll go with the one that not only works as a henchman during his entire screen time, but has an army of creatures that look similar to him that exist only to be henchmen. Number 1, Baraka from Mortal Kombat. Baraka is the general of the Tarkatan species. They're a bunch of goblin dudes with sharp teeth and blades in their arms. They're sent out en masse by Shao Kahn or whoever they're working for to wreck a bunch of stuff and take no prisoners. But really, they just exist to get run over while making the main villain look like he has a lot of power and resources. But the Tarkatan that can go the furthest of them all is Baraka. While other Tarkatan lose in a few hits, Baraka can go a full fight. He still gets defeated by the end of it, but when an extra fight is needed in a story mode, Baraka is always ready. Baraka and the Tarkatan's jobs include invading, restraining prisoners, invading, loading up arms, invading, cake decorating, and invading. Baraka dealing with his subordinate playing with the gun when loading up arms is low-key one of the funniest scenes in the story modes. He's like, "Dude, what are you doing? That is dangerous. Go load something not lethal instead." Baraka feels like he should be more dangerous than he ultimately is since he has retractable blades in his arms. That seems like it should make him scary to go near, but people either manage to avoid every lethal slash when fighting him, or they get video game survival abilities and can just walk off being impaled. Like, I know he's fighting gods and otherworldly creatures, but even when he fights against normal humans who have no idea he has real blade arms, they manage to make it out of the fight with just a few clothing rips. But as I said, Baraka lasts longer than his soldiers. What I like about Baraka's blade arms is they seem like they would just have basic cutting capabilities, but Baraka uses them beyond the extent that you would expect. Yes, they can cut and slice and do all that, but Baraka thinks, oh, these are sharp, I should move them around as much as possible. He may not have grace, but he can move his arms fast, which means he's moving those blades fast. He can also just charge at you with the blades out. He's even aware of the properties of physics and knows he can create a spark by scraping the blades against each other. Now that's a practical projectile. And I may have said he has no grace when he attacks, but he can actually do a ballerina spin with the blades out to turn himself into a blender. It goes to show that Baraka is actually pretty smart. He's mainly hindered by his loyalty being unbound to the main villain, usually to his detriment. Some arcade mode endings do show him rebelling and freeing the Tarkans from their grunt work, but others just show Baraka getting screwed over. My favorite example of that was in his Mortal Kombat 9 ending, where he defeats Shao Kahn, but it was actually Shang Tsung in disguise the whole time, and Baraka was only attacking the Emperor because he knew it was an imposter, and now Baraka gets rewarded rewarded and stays subservient. So everyone else gets clout for defeating Shao Kahn in their non-canon ending when they win, except Baraka. What a ripoff. At least he got that cool scene in Mortal Kombat 11 where he has level-headed negotiations with Kitana on how to overthrow Shao Kahn. So canonically, he makes out okay. I've always liked Baraka and wanted the best endings for him. So here's looking to a good future for Tarkatan kind. He may always be one of the underlings of a greater evil, but with a blade in a dream, Baraka can cut through all the competition and maybe just chill out for a bit. So let's give it up for Shao Kahn's Employee of the Month and the #1 henchman in fighting games, Baraka.
Baraka wins.
Now, what did you think? Were all these henchmen worthy of keeping their jobs, or should some of them have been fired or promoted? Who are your favorite henchmen in fighting games? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video.